18 March 1945, Kasanohara, Kyushu. The Corsair sits skewed in the grass beyond a gouged strip of dirt tail, low propeller bent in two places, heat shivering off the cowl. Men from the Kasanohara Naval Air Group jog out with a handcart, and a hose boot's thudding faces turned up every few steps. Someone slaps the fire lever on the cart, and it coughs. Another waves them wider, palms down, keep quiet, keep low. A rigger reaches the left wing and knocks one's knuckles, expecting metal. The sound is a dull, padded thud. He frowns, presses the heel of his hand into the fabric, and feels the stiffness underneath. His partner follows the gull's elbow fingertips, tracing the heavy hinge where the wing folds. The casting is thick, the bolts are fat, the line of the spar is unbowed. Fuel hangs in the air like a warning. Coolant ticks and drips into the dark stain below the nose. The canopy is starred, the harness dangles open against an armored seatback. A petty officer cuts a circle with his arm, and they begin to pull the camouflage net across the nose. The mesh rasps over chipped paint. A loose tag flaps once and goes still. A corporal ducks to the wheel well and stares at the geometry ungainly on the ground, but solid, the kind of thing that forgives a bad arrival. He squints into a flying gun, sees the feed chutes intact, and dirty the covers, scuffed but not torn. He writes quickly in a pocketbook and tucks the pencil behind his ear. The field radio cracks and the crew freezes. A low, distant hum lifts to a hard, bright roar. Tracers skip the far edge of the airport and vanish. Men flatten, then rise together in the practiced way of people who have done this every day this week. The petty officer jerks the net farther, and two hands grab the bent prop to shift the nose a hand's breadth into deeper grass. The hose hisses once and is shut. Steam curls and thins. A truck rattles in from the perimeter and stops short. A technical officer climbs down, glances once at the sky, then at the wing root. He doesn't speak for a moment. He taps the cowl ring, then the rolled bead along a panel seam, and his knuckle comes back red with dust. Calipers appear from a canvas pouch. He measures the hinge block, the gauge of the skin, and the width of the spar cap. He writes a line in neat print and underlines two words. He asks for a photograph of the fold joint and the seat back, nothing else. Inside the cockpit, the switches are blunt guards, simple and square. The sight glass is clean. The stick is nicked where a gloved hand rubbed it raw. There is nothing delicate to scold. Everything looks built to shrug off handling. The technical officer notes the fabric again on the control surfaces and the sections of wing where it matters for response, then raps the knuckle of the gull joint for a third time, as if confirming a rumor. The sound is firm and full. He nods once. Across the water, on a deck that smells of avgas and hot paint, a board on Essex holds a call sign that will not be erased yet. The flight deck moves like a shop floor spot. Launch, recover, refuel, rearm, launch again. Harmon Utter walks the catwalk with a headset to his ear. Lieutenant Commander Frank Patriarca signs a line, checks a watch, turns away. No one says much. A plane captain slaps a fuselage twice, steps back, thumbs out. A Corsair rolls forward into the wind. Back at Kasanohara, the petty officer folds the pocketbook closed and pushes it into the technical officer's hand. A line of dark fluid threads from a severed line and disappears into soil. The men hold the net down with sandbags and peer through its squares toward the runway. The radio murmurs again, this time lowers and fades. A last photo pops in a handheld flash. The smell of powder is brief and sharp. The crew looked up when the sky rumbled far north, then down again at the machine in front of them. The list of numbers grows. The field's noise drains away by degrees. Cooling metal clicks. A drop falls, and another measured like a metronome, into the stain beneath the nose. The men do not speak. The aircraft says nothing at all. The Kyushu afternoon in mid-March, 1945, had its own rhythm. The thin mist receded from the patch strips around the runways. Repair crews filled bomb craters with damp earth and burlap camouflage. Nets lowered and raised to the distant hum of engines. The entire Kagoshima Kanoya Tomitaka Nitagahara airfield complex operated on a schedule that flexed with the rain of steel. At Kasanohara, the watchman added a line to the log, an intact belly-down Corsair frame pulled to the grassy edge and covered with netting. This was unusual enough. Most enemy planes simply returned to sea as smoke. An intact fuselage meant a chance to measure, and measuring meant dispelling rumors. Offshore, the attack rhythm continued like a chain. On the deck of the USS Essex carrier Air Group 83 rotated motionlessly, station, takeoff, recover, refuel, reload, takeoff again. CAG, Harmon Utter, walked along the rail and listened to the deckhand's brief briefing. Lieutenant Commander Frank Patriarca crossed out a box on the board and passed the radio to the next plane. A call sign that hadn't returned was circled, a new line drawn in chalk for the next wave. Losses were recorded as targets to be repaired, not as reasons for a break in the rhythm. It was an unfamiliar pressure for an air defense system, accustomed to good enough to tell battles where a few well-timed dives could take out a group of bombers. In Kyushu, the war was compressed into days. The Japanese retained most of their experienced pilots as a rare asset. Each intact plane was a strategic savings. What they still believed was the trick-light aircraft, good climb, straight pull, sharp steering, would put the heavy American aircraft in a dead corner. Instructors still repeated the familiar music: hold altitude, force the enemy into a tight circle, and finish in a few corners before his comrades arrived. The myth that remained was the feeling of being able to break the rhythm of an intruder with a clean move and then disappear from range. The myth stood for many years, until a Corsair frame lay still in the grass, revealing details that did not fit the old story. From the description of the airport crew, the technical engineers measured what they did not want to see very hard, where it should be softened by fabric on the control surfaces and the stress areas around the wing joints. Landing gear seatbacks were ominously thick. An aircraft that was already labeled heavy and crude was showing the design of take a beating to keep working. This translated directly into the language of survival when the first sight appeared at 200 meters. Whoever kept the sight steady through the shaking for 3 seconds won the battle. If the structure did not twist, if the landing gear forgave a lopsided touchdown, if the control line still responded quickly after a hard pull, then the tricks of shaking the enemy out of sight were no longer as cheap as before. For the Americans, the fall of a Japanese airframe did not create a moment of silence on the deck. A replacement fuselage was immediately slid into place. Mechanics were swapping the other plane's cracked cowling into the shop. Weapons were reloaded according to charts. Pilots were taking off according to schedules. The unabated tempo was a message that the engineering department at Kasanohara could sense, even when they could not see the deck. This morning, a Corsair A was measured in the afternoon. Another Corsair was heard sweeping by. As the enemy turned the loss into tomorrow's schedule, the rumor of brittle and tired died. All the measurements on the Corsair raise a larger question of cadence. If the aircraft was built to operate between rigorous landing cycles, with the emphasis on quick repairs and quick swaps, would medium-range intercepts still make sense to push back the schedule? If each encounter meant the attacker only lost a square on the board, and the next morning the new square was full, the defender's best strategy might no longer be to hunt in broad daylight, but to hide for a few local moments of need. Conversely, if the engineers found evidence of a genuine structural weakness and there was a chance to recreate the cadence cuts in the air, days, not hours, could be bought before Okinawa began to eat people. On the American side, the strategic objective at this time sounded chillingly simple: maintain pressure until every forward airfield was worth only one last takeoff. Maintain a steady barrage of attacks on runways, fuel depots, ammunition depots, and command posts, forcing the airfields into a permanent state of patchwork. They didn't need a pretty story. They needed a steady rhythm. On the Japanese side, the calculation was clear: don't fight battles that would wear down experienced pilots if there was no chance of imposing terrain and surprise. Concentrate aircraft on favorable days and angles of approach. Maintain the ability to strike back when the enemy was about to change the phase of the campaign. The problem was that every day a veteran pilot was retained was now more valuable than every hour lost on the deck of an enemy ship. The Corsair at Kasanohara was thus more than a trophy. It was a measure of an old belief. When an engineer tapped the wing joint and wrote very hard in his notebook, it was not a compliment. It was a warning to the doctrine of the day's defense to keep the pilot, reduce direct contact, abandon the illusion that the old dive rhythm will break all who come after. And from that note, a new plan was filled out offshore, because the writer knew that what they did today would be repeated tomorrow with the exact number of takeoffs required. The window of conversation here is deliberately narrow. Kyushu, March 1945, repeated sweeps, a Corsair intact under the net, a growing pile of measurements. Everything outside that frame is less important than the thin line between rumor and number. If the number is correct tomorrow, rhythm will win over old story. The intercept scenario had worked because it was true to physics and years of practice to hold altitude, wait for the intruder to burn through his energy in a tight loop, force him out of sight, then finish him off before his comrades arrived. At close range, a little too much of a swing was enough to send the scope off target. Whoever got back in sight first in 3 seconds was the one who lived. On Kyushu in March 1945, that belief still clung to the cockpit, and the defending aircraft were lighter, climbed faster, and a clean turn would make the heavy bodies of the fleet out at sea gasp. It wasn't propaganda. It was born of countless lucky afternoons of well-timed dives. But the stage had changed, and the body of the Corsair lying still under the net at Kasanohara gave one a chance to touch the reason. From the shell, the first things that hit the hand were not numbers but feelings. The wing joints were large, the hand-rolled surface felt thick, the rows of rivets were tight and even. A tap on the outer edge of the wing produced a pop sound from the fabric on the control part, but just moving the fist inward brought back a solid cluck sound from the wing bone. The landing gear left a skewed mark on the ground, revealing a bad touch, but it was not broken. The struts were still straight, the pins were still sealed. The seat back had belt marks on the steel surface. The pipes running along the belly compartment were leaking, the seals on the fuel proofing looked like stitches pulled. All of these things said the same thing without saying a word. Where it was not allowed to fail, they made it difficult to fail. Translating that rough stuff into the language of life, death is a short operation. At 200 meters, right hand on trigger, left hand holding lightly, the fuselage is halfway through its vibration cycle. If the wing and main spar don't twist, the sight stays there longer than a breath, and that's enough. If the landing gear can withstand a flat landing because the runway is broken and the ground is wet, the fuselage can return to duty instead of staying in the field. If the fabric surface on the controls saves some weight and gives a sharper steering response at the end of the flight, the turn to avoid an enemy line of sight doesn't destroy the retaliatory sight. These things aren't fancy for show, they're rough for use. A mechanic can remove a gun cover with a pliers, wipe the dust from the magazine, close it up, and hand the bayonet off to the next crew. A weapons crew can do the right thing by memory. No fancy details, just livable details. In the old scenario, the death zone for the captured was a narrow circle, get pulled in, lose speed, lose. But on Kyushu, now the death zone had changed. American pilots were told to keep their speed, not accept invitations to enter the circle, pull enough to escape, then lock their tails high and long. What kept that tactic from breaking was the ability to maintain their sights after a sharp turn. The wing spars didn't deform enough for the sight to jump out of frame. The gun stayed on target when the grip tightened. In those few seconds, the story of the trick lost to the story of the process. A memorized trick might win a few times. A standardized process won every day. Stepping out of the shell and back onto the battered ground of Kasanohara, one sees something else. The way a fuselage takes a beating and completes its landing cycle says a lot about tomorrow. On the surface are dense chipped wing edges, mud-stained wing tips, below working landing gear and bearings. On the surface are dirty gun barrel covers and fingerprints. Below undamaged ammunition trays, springs still springy. A self-sealing detail has stopped the wet streak. These things don't require a factory. They require time, grease, and just the right amount of skill. That's why out at sea, a blank spot on the sorties board can be filled the next day without anyone changing their tune. To eliminate the possibility of luck, just stay for a few days. Another sweep passes higher, the engine noise drifts in a long line and then dies. On the edge of the lawn, new tire tracks overlap the old ones. In the distance, a frame rotates briefly, glides low, then pulls up. From the net keeper's perspective, it's the same thing. New holes in the ground, new streaks of liquid, but the same order of operations. The air crew run out again to pull the net, put another sandbag, take another frame. No one needs to read the numbers. They just need to see how it repeats, how a heavy body withstands another bad contact, how out at sea, the deck whistle is still timed regularly. The old advantages, to be sure, have not disappeared from the sky. They have merely lost their decisiveness. A sharp climb can still break a distracted opponent. A well-timed dive can still knock a bomber out of formation. But when the enemy relies not on the rare moment, but on the calendar, when each encounter is a clear sequence of operations, from erratic landing to quick fix, from shell change to reload, from inspection to takeoff, the rhythmic attacks break. An afternoon, but not tomorrow. And what an engineer pencils in his logbook is the reason for that durability. Strong construction, where required light surfaces, where possible fire-protected lines, field-changeable layouts. The seemingly trivial features add up to something decisive, an aircraft that keeps the pilot's sights steady through the shake, and that can still get back on the schedule after a bad encounter. In this context, the habits of the defending side also changed, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Runways were covered with nets, planes were pulled deeper into the tree line, test takeoffs were moved closer to the necessary time. Daytime interceptions only made sense when placed in the right place with the chance of massing and surprise. For the rest, people learned to swallow their silence through repeated sweeps. The only thing that told a new story was the measuring book that thickened with each page, thickness here, width there, number of rivets on the edge of the plate, stiffness of the hinge, arrangement of pipes and wires. Each number was like a nail in the coffin of the old story. Out at sea, no one needs that number to continue, but it is the number that explains why they don't stop. A deck crew knows which panel to open, which pin to pull, which cap to turn. A pilot knows not to accept the invitation to circle, knows to back off a little, to maintain speed and keep his sights. A deck officer knows which parts of the body will take the rope which need more padding. There is no magic, only good habits. And it is that habit that makes the muzzle blast at 200 meters fall into the 3-second frame. None of this needs to be fancy to be terrifying. In those 3 seconds, a fuselage decides the fate of the person at the other end. In the next half-minute, a landing gear decides whether that fuselage will return tomorrow. And the following afternoon, a sortie board on a ship decides whether the attack will stop. It all comes together with details that can be felt in Kasanohara: thick wing, hinges, well-placed fabric surfaces, self-rescuing ducts, crash-proof steel-backed seats. No need for words, no need for far-fetched comparisons. Just listen to the click of the gull joints and watch the hand of the mechanic slide the net down the nose. Not an accident. This is repeatable. The grass at Kasanohara is wet enough to stain the cuffs of trousers and cling to boots. The Corsair lies under a net that sags between bamboo poles, canted nose, twisted propeller, dark fluid threading into the soil. A petty officer signals the crew to keep their heads down when the field phone mutters a distant warning. The air still holds the sting of hot oil. Someone bumps a knuckle on the gull wing's hinge and hears the firm reply of metal. The same hand slides outward and meets the padded thud of fabric on the control surface. A corporation sets a caliper on the hinge block and calls a number too low to be heard beyond the net. A line of pencil figures grows on a damp page. Across the water, a deck horn barks and men in yellow shirts raise both arms. A Corsair inches forward on a painted chevron, and a plane captain slaps the fuselage twice and steps clear. A line chief swings a hand in a tight arc, and the tail lifts against the holdback. A voice on the squawk box is flat and quick. Identify, acquire, fire, relocate. On the catwalk, Harmon Utter listens, nods once, and moves on. Lieutenant Commander Frank Patriarca checks a watch face, folds the strap, looks down the deck, and gives a short point. The nose dips into the wind and vanishes in a roar. Back under the net, the petty officer does the math any crewman can do. If this machine arrived crooked and did not fold up, it was built for bad arrivals. He traces the weld beads around the gear attachment point and sees no hairline. A mechanic opens an ammunition flight and reveals feed chutes packed with grit but straight. The latch closes without complaint. The smell inside the cockpit is rubber and sweat and the faint sweetness of fuel. Switch guards are square, not ornate. The sight sits unbothered behind clear glass. The harness buckle clinks against an armored seatback. A technical officer arrives on a truck that rattles like cutlery in a drawer, steps down without haste and wraps the cowling ring. He does not waste breath on adjectives. He calls for one photograph of the fold joint and another of the backplate. He measures again and underlines a figure. On Essex, a call sign on the board is circled in chalk. One slot is empty for the moment. The next slot is already being filled. A crewman pulls a hose and locks it to a filler. A woman's bracelet-sized circle of metal swallowed by a hand in a glove. The smell of avgas walks the deck. Ordnance men kneel at a rack with the bored look of people who can do the task in their sleep but do not permit themselves to. The ready room is a cool box with a coffee taste on the air that no one notices. A section leader mentions flak bursts near one field, and pencil points drift briefly, then return to checklists. There is no speech about honor or vengeance. The orders are elastic, only where safety demands. Kasanohara flinches when a group of fighters scribbles the far end of the sky and is gone. The crew under the net waits for the last echo, then works. Sandbags settle into new positions with the soft crunch of damp soil. One man in a stained cap coils the hose and glances at the stained under the nose of the captured machine. It no longer grows. He wipes his fingers on his trousers and looks through the squares of the net towards the runway. The petty officer taps the corporal's pencil with the back of his hand, write the diameter, write the spacing, write the bend radius. The corporation writes faster. A pilot on the carrier pulls his gloves up and runs a thumb down each finger to seat the fabric. He calls flaps and trim and mag checks with a voice that assumes agreement. The deck trembles beneath his boots before he even moves because something else is already moving. A handler grins without reason and then removes the grin in case it means something. The pilot watches a set of twin lights ahead of him and waits to feel the sudden weight that only happens when there is sea under a deck and the deck has made up its mind. The technical officer at Kasanohara thumbs the edge of a page to keep it from buckling and leans into the cockpit with a painter's patience. He does not linger. He holds a small mirror to catch light on the hinge pin and marks the width. He asks the petty officer to push the aileron through a small arc and listens with his fingertips at the hinge line. He nods without looking up. When he steps back, his boots leave small dark ovals that vanish, like the grass springs up. He does not congratulate the material. He acknowledges a problem of time. On the carrier, a pair of chalks slide away, and a set of hands you can map by scars fan the air in a motion that means both you can go and you must go. The nose rises on a breath of thrust, and the entire world squeezes into a length of deck no longer than a memory. Then the pilot has air under him again, and the memory becomes a rumor, and he talks only to his wingman, and the crackle of traffic that uses verbs like pin and drag and break. That means shapes in space, not people. He hears his own voice say, acquire, and does not think about what the word used to mean in any other context. The corporation at Kasanohara wipes his caliper with a rag that was white when the war began and holds it to the edge of a spar cap. He squints and says the number. The petty officer repeats it without inflection, and the technical officer writes it down. The corporal shifts his weight to ease a rock under his knee and notices a long scuff where the leading edge meets something it should not have and did not tear. He taps the scuff, then the muscle of metal behind it, and learns with his knuckles what the engineer will confirm with a file and a microscope later. He closes the bay door, and it latches like a cupboard in a good kitchen. A deck crewman with a pencil behind one ear and a wrench in his back pocket flips a placard, and the number on the placard means nothing to anyone not on the ship and everything to everyone on it. A gunnery officer glances down a line of fuses without understanding, because that is not his job, and then stops because nothing about them requires his comprehension. Joy is not part of the vocabulary. Fear is somewhere else with the men who track the weather. The men under the net do not trust the quiet and never will. They act as if the next pass will come without warning because this week it usually does. A runner lopes in from the field office and brings a camera case and a rubber bulb. The case opens and swallows a glass plate that the air barely warms. The technical officer stands where his shadow will not foul the exposure. The petty officer holds the net back just long enough for light to do its work. When the bulb wheezes and the shutter claps like two hands in a church, the men breathe again. On the carrier, the radio gives a clipped rectangle of sound. Target burning. Shift left. Watch the flanks. The message is a report and an instruction, and also a way to avoid thinking about what sits under the word target. The muscles of the ship move fuel and food and ammunition in appropriate directions, and somebody with a wrench and a temper cracks a stuck fitting, and somebody else with a pen and a calm face writes down that the fitting cracked, and nobody says sorry to anybody. An airplane that did not belong to the ship yesterday belongs to it now. A pilot whose name is easy to say replaces one whose name everyone can say without meaning to. Under the net, a mechanic slides a palm across the seat back and feels the dull, dense promise of armor. He thinks about nothing, except whether it will be difficult to remove if someone asks him to remove it. The technical officer says one word that means, "Take this down." The petty officer repeats it with a tone that means, "Do it now." The corporation writes a phrase that translates to "very strong construction," even though the page will not travel far and the phrase will not be quoted in any speech. The engineer underlines a number, and a line of graphite goes shiny. The petty officer knots the cord on the camera case and hands it up. On Essex, a plane captain kneels and threads a tie-down, and then undoes it because the next aircraft does not require it, and he knows that because the sequence is printed in his bones. A cook bangs a pot against a rail, and no one hears it over the wind. A signalman turns his head to read a flag, and forgets the colors a heartbeat later, because the movement itself is the message. Patriarca looks over a shoulder and says nothing. The deck gives back a little of the sea's motion and then takes it again. At Kasanohara, the technical officer stands with his pencil on a line he has not written and waits for the field to decide whether to be loud again. The crew waits with him. The petty officer puts the list of numbers in a canvas bag and pulls the cord tight enough to mark his fingers. The corporation pushes 2 sandbags closer to the wheel and watches a droplet fall from the oil cooler and disappears on contact with the soil. The crew breathes through their mouths to keep from tasting the air. They are not thinking about tomorrow. They are thinking about whether they should move the net 4 fingers to the left to break a silhouette that only exists if a man is looking from a certain place in the sky at a certain angle. Far at sea, a pilot rolls and feels the stick push back with a familiar temper and knows in his hands that the wing will keep its shape through the buffet. He is not grateful. He is occupied. He has a sentence in his ear that begins with identify and ends with nothing at all because the sentence is never meant to end. He does what the sentence requires. On the field, the technical officer closes the notebook and taps the edge against his leg to settle the pages. The petty officer signals the crew to clear the immediate ground of anything that shines. The corporate drapes a spare scrap of net over the nose, where the existing cover sags. The truck turns with a sound like a drawer closing. The men do not say what they have learned out loud. They know that writing it has already said enough. They won't brag. They will hide and measure and wait. Out on the deck, a chalk mark is wiped off the board and replaced with another line that belongs to tomorrow. No one celebrates the erasure. The ship leans, and the air on the bow is colder than the air at the stern, and no one cares. The routine is an animal that never sleeps. It eats fuel and men and hours, and grows stronger on repetition. It teaches its own grammar to everyone who serves it, until their voices sound alike when they speak the short words. Under the net, the petty officer listens for engines and hears none. He thinks of the next pass anyway and keeps the men close to the ground. The technical officer places the notebook in a case and hands it to the driver without looking. The corporal rubs a black smear off his thumb and smiles not at victory but at a smear that comes away clean. The crew steps back from the captured machine, and the net makes it vanish into the grass. Out at sea, a wheel turns, a cable tightens, a body leans against a bulkhead and thinks of nothing. The next launch time is inked in block letters and will happen whether someone is ready for it or not. The voice on the radio returns to the beginning of the sentence and starts again. Identify, acquire, fire, relocate. The air agrees, the ship agrees, the day agrees. The men agree because the sentence is the only thing that keeps them from thinking about anything else. At Kasanohara, the field goes quiet enough for a fly to become a drum. The captured Corsair breathes out the last of its heat. The numbers in the notebook feel heavier than paper should be. The petty officer ties the bag a second time. The truck rolls away. The net holds. The air is still. The lesson will travel without escort. The notebook from Kasanohara rides to Yokosuka in a canvas bag that smells of fuel and damp grass. A clerk slides it across a bench to a technical officer who reads the numbers out loud only once. Wing fold casting depth, hinge pin diameter, skin gauge at the knuckle, seat back thickness, self-sealing treatment on tank walls, gear leg cross-section, and attach angle. The officer pencils a short line at the bottom of the page and pushes the file to the next desk. A photographer lays 2 plates of the fold joint and 1 of the back plate. The file grows to a folder, and the folder grows to a circulating slip with 3 recipients: the airfield district, the training bureau, and the operational section that writes day of flight advisories. The note is not an essay. It says what matters the captured Corsair's construction is far stronger than expected at the hinge and gear attach. Control surfaces use fabric to save weight and keep response. Systems behind the pilot are protected. The implicit sentence is the one everyone understands. Do not expect one rough arrival to sideline this airplane. Plan accordingly. At Kasanohara, the effect is practical. Taxi paths are redrawn to stay under tree lines. Engine warm-ups are moved as late as possible. Dispersal revetments gain a second tier of netting. A short memo warns against daytime mixing fights, unless surprise and numbers are certain. The ground crew still measure and still write, but the language in the field office shifts from how to engage to how to be hard to find. Nothing about pride is written down. The men already know where pride leads in daylight. Off Kyushu, the pattern on Essex answers without reading any of it. Cag Harmon Utter speaks with his deck officer over a list that changes color when someone marks it, and the list remains full. Lieutenant Commander Frank Patriarca watches the sequence tighten and tighten again, and talks in four-word phrases that do not admit sentiment. Losses are real, and they are handled by spares. A cracked cowling is not an invitation to empathy. It is a signal to roll a fresh airframe into the spot. A call that ends mid-syllable is logged and triggers a pilot rotation that was pre-built for that eventuality. The cycle survives because the cycle was designed to survive. Debrief at dusk is not theater. A section leader mentions that flak stitched the lower approach to a named strip. The note becomes a chalk mark near the sortie board and a change in approach angle for the next strike. A landing pilot reports a stutter at high power. A line chief moves a crew to check the magnetos and signs an entry. Fuel and ammunition are pre-staged by habit, not by inspiration. The next morning, someone flips a placard, a new bureau number fills a grid square, and the deck returns to its rhythm. The ship is a system that converts incidents into checklists at speed. The difference between the two systems is not courage, and it is not intelligence. At Yokosuka, the technical officer who wrote very strong construction knows enough mathematics to understand what it means. If the opponent's fighter keeps its shape through buffet and shrugs off a crooked arrival, then pilots who try to break it with dances in sunlight will pay a price that cannot be replaced. Veteran pilots are capital. Airframes are capital. The line of replacement is thin. The file that travels back to Kyushu is a form of triage. Conserve assets for moments that can alter a local fight. Spend nothing on routine attention. Make the enemy waste his time and his fuel. The capture that should have fed confidence instead revises doctrine. On the carrier, the same captured truth translates into something else justification. The reason to keep tempo is inside that Yokosuka sentence. If the American fighter can take a hard pull and keep the sight steady, then the standing rule not to accept turning fights is easier to obey. Dive and expand. Maintain speed. Regain a steady picture and shoot on your terms. If battle damage corrupts a panel or bends a prop, do not romance the wounded machine. Swap it. If a debrief produces a fault pattern, update the deck card and read it at breakfast. No one writes a speech about this. The habit spreads on its own. The human pieces of the chain behave to type. A plane captain on Essex learns more about sequences than about airplanes. He knows which tie down to cut first and which to leave until the last sound. An ordnance man cares that a feed jam last sortie requires a different lube schedule today and does not care how the jam felt to the pilot. A line chief has a map of repair categories in his head: deck fixable, hangar fixable, depot fixable, throwaway. A change of category is a tangible thing. It changes where hands go at sunrise. At Kasanohara, a petty officer reads from the Yokosuka advisory without hiding his disappointment. Avoid daylight mixes unless surprise and numbers favor you. Move aircraft deeper into cover. Delay warm-ups. Do not assume a bent propeller grounds the intruder for long. The men do not argue because the weak has already answered for them. They lift nets, shift sandbags, push fuel drums farther into shade. A runner chalks an arrow on a strip of board to redirect taxi turns that were too visible from the air. The technical officer files the shallow groove from a hinge pin taken as a sample and leaves an annotation that will run only to other technicians. The line about strength will go to operators. On Essex, the bridge hears a new report and shortens the gap between two launches by a sliver. The strike planners shave a minute from a recovery window to reduce overlap with a battery that proves more alert than expected. The rhythm is flexible within boundaries the crew can feel under their feet. The sea decides some of those boundaries. The rest are printed in the ship's bones. None of it depends on people being exceptional. It depends on them being consistent. The inspection that began under a net thus becomes two different orders. On the home islands, it becomes an instruction to hide and to choose fights only when the ground and the sky are kind. On the carrier, it becomes an instruction to keep moving because there is nothing delicate to protect and nothing to be gained by pausing. The same fact yields two doctrines because the two systems sit on different foundations. One cannot lose what it cannot replace. The other can afford to feed its routine. A small example explains the larger rule. A Corsair noses in hard on recovery and creases a panel near a hinge line. The deck note reads, "Replace panel, inspect hinge, swap airframe if cycle timing tight." A replacement airframe fueled and armed moves into the launch queue while the creased one is towed aside. The launch tally stays on schedule. A parallel example on land reads differently. A defending interceptor takes a pebble on takeoff, shreds a tire, and digs a rut. The field crew can fix the rut. They cannot summon a new wheel and tube by radio on a day when the depot is under pressure. The aircraft waits. The pilot waits. The moment they were meant to influence passes. The order to conserve begins to feel less like prudence and more like defeat, but it is still correct. The paper trail is visible in objects. On the ship tie-downs, chalk marks spare cowlings. A hose that finds the same filler neck at the same minute every hour, a board with a gap that never stays open for long. On the field, net sandbags, chalk taxi arrows, camera plates of a hinge joint that traveled to a desk and returned as a line in an advisory. These objects are choreography, not decoration. They enforce a choice about how to spend courage. By the end of the week, the phrases have settled into people's mouths. The fighter pilots on the carrier do not say it like doctrine, but they fly it. Do not accept turning fights. Dive and expand. Shoot from a steady picture. Swap the machine, not the mission. Debrief at dusk, card change by dawn. On the field, the crews say their phrases too. Concealment before readiness. Engines cold until necessary. Avoid daylight mixes unless you can guarantee surprise. None of this promised victory. It promises survival, and on the other side, pressure. The notebook that left Kasanohara as a bag of measurements thus returns as a small shift in how a region fights. The men who took the pictures and scratched the numbers do not see the memos move. They see the nets go lower and the taxi paths bend, and they hear fewer speeches about classic maneuvers. Out at sea, the men who never read the memos see a launch time hold steady and a new bureau number fill a space before anyone could worry about the old one. Between the two, daylight becomes a little less theatrical and a little more scheduled. It goes into a file, and the file becomes procedure. The week does not announce itself. It is simply the stretch of days when numbers in a notebook stop being curiosities and start rearranging drills. The captured Corsair under the net at Kasanohara has already yielded its hinge depths, its gauge at the knuckle, the seatback that does not ring like tin, the damp seam that shows where a self-sealing lining did its work. A technical officer closes the mirror he used to catch light on a pin and writes a single sentence at the bottom of a page that matters more than the page. Looks construction at hinge, and gear is very strong. It is not a flourish. It is a verdict against the assumption that a hard arrival retires a carrier fighter for the day. On the field, the myth had been practical. Make the heavy intruder accept a turn, then break him. Daylight mixing fights were supposed to be leverage, climb, straight, roll tight, force him to bleed, speed, and reveal a stall he cannot smooth out. A bent prop or a scuffed hinge was supposed to reward the effort with absence tomorrow. Now, men who know the smell of hot oil and the weight of sandbags look at the photograph of a fold joint and at a line that says very strong, and they draw the taxi arrows to pass beneath trees. Warm-ups move later. Nets fall lower. Veteran pilots are not being prepared to trade turns. They are being preserved for when surprises and numbers agree. In the air above Kyushu, the counterscript that once greeted those invites is no longer theorized. U.S. fighters refuse gracefully. They do not take the first bait into a circle. They pull hard enough to escape the geometry and then hold speed in a shallow line until a steady sight picture returns. The same structure that resisted a crooked arrival takes the buffet in stride. The wing keeps its shape through the shake that used to scatter a reticle. Identify, acquire, fire, relocate. The verbs sound like the ship that bred them, and they are hard to argue with because they return the pilot to the deck on time. Repetition kills the last refuge of accident. Within days, the pattern repeats over the same fields. A section crosses the edge of sky flak, smears the air, a fighter dives through, pulls, bears, marks that would have grounded a delicate machine, and shows up again tomorrow with a different bureau number and the same manners. On the ground, the men who stretched nets on Monday stretch them again on Thursday, and notice they are using the same knots for different aircraft. The one-off explanation becomes impolite to utter. Schedule beats spectacle, and it does so in full view. The documents begin to sound like what the hands already do. Yokosuka circulates an advisory that does not waste words. Concealment before readiness. Engines cold until necessary. Avoid daylight mixes unless surprise and numbers guarantee value. Do not assume rough arrivals remove the intruder from tomorrow's cycle. At sea, the after-action cards harden the mirror image. Do not accept turning fights. Dive, extend, rebuild a steady picture. Swap airframes, not missions. Keep tempo. On Essex, CAG Harmon Utter adjusts launch by slivers where the day demands spacing it. Lieutenant Commander Frank Patriarca points at a time on the board with the same finger he used yesterday, and the motion means the same thing today. No one gives speeches about collapse. A petty officer at Kasanohara reads the line about strength and closes the folder with a thumb that still carries graphite from the hinge measurements. He drills dispersal again, because daylight now feels like a condition to endure, not a stage to perform on. He is not humiliated by change. He is made practical by it. On the carrier, a line chief flips a placard to close a gap made by a loss and opens space for a replacement airframe with a motion that contains no triumph and no grief. The cycle allows neither. The myth does not die with a headline. It dies in drills that are suddenly different. The tactical layer shows itself in stutters and absences. There are fewer attempts to shepherd intruders into turns in broad sun. When a mix does begin, it happens where shade and altitude favor the defender and ends quickly if those favors evaporate. The Americans, who never stop flying like a checklist, accept the brevity and make a pass for their own terms. They are not stubborn. They are consistent. The Japanese, who once taught the beauty of the perfect climb and the clean break, begin to behave like men who have seen an armored backplate with their hands and do not confuse poetry with survival. There is confirmation in the paperwork process. A photograph of the Corsair's fold joint acquires a stamp and a circulation path. A short clause in an operations sheet instructs engines to remain cold until the last practical minute. A diagram of dispersal adds a second tier of netting and a correction to a taxi bend that mocked cover by shaving a corner too cleanly. The advisory's last line, the one about not counting on damage to sideline the enemy, fades, not because it is wrong, but because it quickly becomes obvious. The deck's answer is visible from any distance. The gap never stays a gap for long. By the end of the week, the language on both sides has shortened. The men on the ship do not say doctrine. They say dive and extend, and everyone knows the rest. The men on the field do not say myth. They say under the trees and the engines are cold, and everyone finishes the sentence in silence. The captured airframe has traveled exactly as far as it needed to, from net to notebook to note to habit. Its strength at a hinge pin denies daylight turns their promise. Its tolerance for a bad arrival denies attrition its bargain. No one announces the date, but there is one. It is the last day anyone at Kasanohara planned to break a heavy fighter by inviting it to dance in the sun, and the first day they planned to be elsewhere when the music started. That was the last day. Daylight turns felt like a plan. Late March on Kyushu begins with the same mist and ends with different habits. At Kasanohara, the taxi arrows bend under trees, not across open grass. Warm-ups slip toward the last possible minute. Nets gain a second tier. Sandbags move until the wheel ruts disappear into shadow. A canvas folder with a Yokosuka stamp sits on a field desk. Inside, a glass plate of the Corsair's folded knuckle and a short line in pencil carry more weight than any speech. Very strong construction. The phrase cancels the last daytime invitations to turn. Crews rehearse concealment before readiness. Veteran pilots wait for surprise and numbers, not choreography. Off Kyushu, the cadence on Essex does not blink. CAG Harmon Utter trades inches of launch spacing for minutes of recovery margin, and the board stays full. Lieutenant Commander Frank Patriarca watches a gap appear and closes it with a new bureau number before the chalk dust settles. A cracked cowling becomes a swap, not a stand-down. Debrief at dusk notes a flak pocket on the lower approach. The morning card adds one sentence, and the pattern swerves around it without losing rate. Identify, acquire, fire, relocate. The verbs keep their edge because they live on a schedule, not in a story. The changes show first in absences. Daylight mixes thin out, unless an ambush geometry appears. When a turn begins without surprise, it stops quickly. The defender breaks contact and lives to try again at a better angle. The Americans refuse turns like a reflex, hold speed, rebuild a steady picture, and make one clean pass before climbing out. The hinge that does not give back under buffet denies the romance of a drawn circle. The gear that forgives a crooked arrival denies attrition its bargain. The myth of breaking a heavy fighter in sunlight becomes an errand few are willing to run. Paper keeps pace with practice. Yokosuka's advice: concealment first. Engines cold. Avoid routine. Mixing steps from a memo into a standing field order. Kasanohara's chalked taxi bends get repainted under canopy. A clerk pins the stamped photo next to the dispersal diagram and draws a thicker line where the trees begin. On deck, the after-action card hardens 4 short rules. Refuse the turn, dive and extend, shoot from a steady picture, swap airframes and keep tempo. No one calls them doctrine. They are simply the way the day works. Morale without shift ceremony. On the ship, fear becomes procedural confidence. If a panel creases or a prop takes a pebble, the mission moves to a fresh airframe and the cycle keeps its time. On the field, the aura of breaking raids in daylight turns into burden management: hide, survive, pick the hour. The same men who measured a hinge pin with calipers now measure the shadow line of a net and accept that both measurements decide who flies tomorrow. Not everything yields. Flak still bites when timing is careless. Weather still pulls thin men. An ambush at the right altitude still hurts. But habit beats highlight on most days. The evidence sits in objects: a stamped plate of a fold joint and a canvas folder on land, a tie-down cycle and a placard flip at sea. Gaps close with a fresh bureau number. The brief changes by 1 sentence. If this understanding refused daylight turns, dive, extend, swap the airframe, not the mission had spread across every deck 2 months earlier. How many daytime mixes over Kyushu would have ended before they began, if Yokosuka's very strong construction verdict had reached every group? Faster would turn. Invites have disappeared a month before Okinawa. Next, we follow the same logic into a massive silhouette, the P-47 over Kyushu, why ground units called it a flying bulldozer, and how turning fights died twice, once in the air, once on paper. Daylight stopped being a duel and became a schedule.